Before I tell you what happened, drop a comment. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it? It might not seem important, but in stories like this, time and place tend to matter more than people realize. So go on. Do it before the rain outside your window starts whispering. And you forget you ever heard this at all. Have you ever heard the sound of rain hitting a tent? The gentle pitter-patter that transforms into a symphony of tiny drum beats as the storm intensifies? It's one of those sounds that should be comforting. Nature's lullaby as you're wrapped up warm in your sleeping bag. But what if I told you that sometimes, just sometimes, that same sound can mask other things? Things that shouldn't be there. Things that shouldn't exist. I'm only sharing this now because I need someone else to know. Perhaps you're listening to this in the comfort of your home, with rain tapping against your window. Perhaps you're even outdoors somewhere. If you are, I sincerely hope it's nowhere near Lolo National Forest. It was meant to be a simple weekend trip. Just me, alone with nature. Clear in my head after a particularly grueling month at work. I've been camping dozens of times before, always prepared, always careful. I'm not some tourist who wanders into the wilderness with nothing but a Mars bar and blind optimism. I've proper gear, proper training, and proper respect for the wild. The forecast had predicted light showers. Nothing dramatic. I'd chosen a somewhat isolated spot in Lolo National Forest, about 2 miles away from the nearest designated campsite. Not technically off limits, but certainly off the beaten path. The kind of place where you can truly disconnect. I arrived late Friday afternoon, with plenty of daylight left to set up camp. The air felt heavy with moisture, that distinctive scent of impending rain hanging in the atmosphere. But the weather held as I established my little outpost. A small one-man tent, a tarp strung between trees for additional shelter, a fire pit ringed with stones. For dinner, I heated a simple meal of beans and sausages over my portable stove, listening to the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. The forest was alive with the usual sounds. Birds calling to one another, the occasional scurrying of small creatures through the underbrush, the creaking groan of ancient trees swaying in the light breeze. As twilight descended, the first few raindrops began to fall. I secured my gear, made sure my tent was properly staked down, and retreated inside just as the shower intensified. Inside my tent, I lit my small lantern and settled in with a paperback thriller. Perfect timing, I thought. The rain would likely pass by morning. But it didn't. If anything, it grew heavier as night fully claimed the forest. The drumming on my tent became a constant companion as I read, occasionally glancing at my watch. By 11, I decided to turn in, switching off my lantern and settling into my sleeping bag. That's when I first noticed something odd. Between the rhythmic pattering of rain, there was another sound. Inconsistent, arrhythmic, a soft crunching of twigs and leaves, as if something or someone was moving carefully through the forest. Probably just a deer, I whispered to myself, trying to ignore the way my heartbeat had suddenly accelerated. But deer don't typically move so deliberately, do they? They bound or trot. This was different, calculated, almost. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the direction. It seemed to be circling my campsite, never coming too close, but never straying too far either. Have you ever felt that sensation of being watched? That prickling along your spine that warns you something's not right? I felt it then, lying motionless in my sleeping bag, hardly daring to breathe. The rational part of my brain insisted it was nothing, just an animal, curious about the human intruder in its domain. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, whispered that I should be afraid. The footsteps, if that's what they were, continued their lazy circuit around my camp. I reached for my torch, though I wasn't entirely sure what I'd do with it. Flash it outside? What if something flashed back? Then they stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the footsteps had been, at least with movement. I could track whatever it was. Now, there was just the rain and the thundering of my own pulse in my ears. Minutes passed like this. How many I couldn't say. 5? 10? Then, just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing, there came a new sound. A gentle tap against the side of my tent. Not the rain. No, this was deliberate. A single, purposeful touch, as if someone was testing the fabric with their finger. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tap came again, a little more insistent this time. And then another, and another. A slow, methodical exploration of my tent's perimeter. Who's there? I called out, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in my voice. I can't hear you. The tapping stopped. For a long, blessed moment, there was only rain again. Then, so softly I almost missed it, a voice replied, "Can I come in?" The voice was wrong. It's difficult to explain precisely how. On the surface, it sounded normal enough. A man's voice, not particularly deep or high. But there was something off about the cadence, the way the words were formed, as if the speaker was unfamiliar with how human speech should sound. "There's a proper campsite 2 miles east." I replied, my mouth dry. "You should head there." A pause. The rain seemed to intensify, hammering against the tent with renewed vigor. "But I'm already here," came the response, still in that oddly modulated tone. "And it's so wet outside." My hand fumbled for my phone. No signal, of course. I'd known that when I chose the spot. Part of the appeal had been disconnecting from the world for a while. How ironic that now seemed. I'm not comfortable with that. I said, more firmly this time, "Please leave." Another pause, longer this time. I began to hope that whoever, or whatever, was out there had taken a hint and moved on. But then came a sound that chilled me to my core. The distinct, unmistakable noise of my tent zipper being slowly pulled upward. I lunged forward, grabbing the zipper from the inside and yanking it back down. "Stop that!" I shouted, panic giving my voice a sharp edge. "Go away!" The resistance on the zipper ceased, but I could still sense a presence just outside. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst through my chest. I reached for my pocket knife, a small, inadequate thing, but better than nothing. "You're being very rude," said the voice, now right beside the tent entrance. "I just want to get out of the rain. Don't you understand how it feels to be cold and wet and lonely?" There was something deeply unsettling about the way it emphasized lonely, stretching the word out, almost savoring it. "I'm warning you," I said, clutching my knife. "I'm armed and I would defend myself." A soft chuckle filtered through the tent fabric. "No need for that. I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk. It's been so long since I've had someone to talk to." Despite my fear, I found myself curious. "Who are you? What are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" "I live here," came the simple reply. "This is my forest. Has been for, a very long time now." "The forest is public land," I countered, wondering why I was even engaged with this clearly disturbed individual. Public. The word was spoken with such contempt that I actually flinched. They draw lines on maps and think that gives them ownership. This forest was here long, before your kind came with your papers and proclamations. It will be here long after you're gone. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through me. My kind? What are you talking about? Another chuckle, this one darker, more guttural. Oh, you know what I mean. Humans, so fragile, so temporary, so convinced of your own importance. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the knife. Look, I don't know who or what you think you are, but I'm not in the mood for games. Either leave or I'm calling for help. A bluff, of course. No signal meant no calls. But he didn't need to know that. No signal here. The voice said, as if reading my thoughts, you chose well. Private, isolated. Just you and me and the rain. I felt sick. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? A hunter or forest ranger trying to scare the lone camper? Or was something more sinister happening? What do you want from me? I asked, hating how vulnerable I sounded. Company, came the immediate reply. It gets lonely out here, especially on rainy nights like this. The sound, it reminds me of things I'd rather forget. As if on cue, a particularly heavy burst of rain pelted the tent. I jumped at the sudden intensity, and the voice outside chuckled again. You're afraid, it observed. Your heart is racing. I can hear it, like a little drum inside your chest. Thump, 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 thump. The imitation was disturbingly accurate, matching my elevated heartbeat perfectly. I felt exposed, as if the tent fabric had turned transparent. Why don't you show yourself? I challenged, surprised at myself at the demand. If you just want to talk, let me see who I'm talking to. A long pause followed. So long, in fact, that I began to wonder if my visitor had silently departed. Then, just as I was about to call out again, you wouldn't like what you saw. The words were spoken with such simple, matter-of-fact certainty that I believed them instantly. Whatever was outside my tent wasn't human, at least not entirely, and it knew that its appearance would terrify me. What are you? I whispered, no longer caring if it heard the fear in my voice. Old, it replied, older than the trees, older than the rain. I was here when this forest was young. I'll be here when it's gone. That's not possible, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't entirely convinced of their truth. Many things are possible in Lolo Forest, the voice said softly, especially on nights like this, when the barrier between worlds grows thin. Haven't you felt it? The watching eyes in the darkness? The whispers beneath the rain? Now that it mentioned it, I had sensed something off about the forest since nightfall, an unusual stillness beneath the storm, as if the entire woodland was holding its breath. But I dismissed it as my imagination, the natural unease of being alone in the wilderness. What happens now? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. You found me. We're talking. What comes next? That depends on you, the voice replied. I could leave, if that's what you truly want. Return to my solitude. Or, I prompted when it didn't continue. Or I could show you things. Secrets of the forest that no human has ever seen. Wonders that would make your brief life meaningful. Despite my fear, or perhaps because of it, I found myself intrigued. What kind of secrets? The kind that change you. It said simply, forever. I should have declined. Should have insisted it leave. Should have huddled in my tent until dawn, when daylight would surely drive away whatever nocturnal madness this was. But something in that voice, a note of ancient loneliness that resonated with something inside me, made me hesitate. If I opened the tent, I said slowly, do you promise not to hurt me? A sound came then, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. I promise not to cause you physical pain. That's the most honest promise I can make. Not exactly reassuring, but strangely, I believed it. Whatever this entity was, it seemed bound by some code of honesty, even if that honesty was unsettling. With trembling fingers, I reached for the tent zipper. My rational mind screamed at me to stop, to reconsider, but curiosity, that eternal human weakness, drove me forward. Slowly, I pulled the zipper up, creating a small opening in the tent flap. Rain immediately spattered through the gap, cold droplets landing on my face. I peered out into the darkness, expecting, well, I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but what I saw was simply a pair of boots, ordinary hiking boots, caked in mud, standing just outside my tent. My gaze traveled upward, taking in faded jeans, a weathered leather jacket, and finally, a face. A human face, or at least something very close to human. A man, perhaps in his 50s, with a grizzled beard and eyes that reflected my torch beam with an unnatural gleam. "You're just a man," I said, relief and confusion mingling in my voice. The figure crouched down, bringing his face level with mine. That's when I noticed the oddities, the too perfect symmetry of his features, the unusual pallor of his skin, the way he didn't seem to blink. "Is this form more comfortable for you?" he asked, his mouth moving slightly out of sync with his words. "I find it useful for interactions." I swallowed hard. "Were you really?" A smile spread across his face, too wide, revealing too many teeth. "Are you sure you want to know? Some questions are better left unanswered." I hesitated, then nodded. "Show me." The smile widened further, well beyond what should have been physically possible. "As you wish." The figure stood and took 3 steps backward into the rain. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as I watched in horrified fascination, the man's form began to shift. It was subtle at first, a ripple across the surface of his skin, like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but it quickly intensified. His outline blurred, edges dissolving into the darkness. The rain seemed to pass through him in places, as if parts of him were no longer solid. And his eyes, God, his eyes, they multiplied, tiny pinpricks of light appearing across what had once been his face, his chest, his arms. "This is close of what I am," the voice said, now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, though still just an approximation your mind can process. I wanted to scream, to run, to hide, but I remained frozen, captivated by the impossible sight before me. Where a man had stood a moment before, there was now something else, a collection of shadows and light, vaguely humanoid but constantly shifting, like smoke caught in a breeze. What do you want from me?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible above the rain. "I told you," the entity replied. "Company, understanding, perhaps remembrance. Remembrance. When you leave this forest, and you will leave, I promise you that I want you to remember me, to know that I exist, that we exist. We," I echoed, a new fear gripping me. The figure gestured to the surrounding forest. "You think I'm the only one? This forest is old, human. It holds many like me. Forgotten things, ancient things, things that were here long before your kind learned to build fires and speak words." As if responding to its statement, I became aware of movements in the darkness beyond. Shapes sliding between trees, glimmers of eyes watching from the underbrush. The entire forest seemed suddenly alive with presence. "Are they like you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "No," the entity replied. "We're all different, products of different times, different beliefs. Some were never human. Some were once, long ago. Some were worshipped as gods. Others were feared as monsters. And which are you? I dared to ask. The figure tilted what passed for its head, considering. Both. Neither. Does it matter? I suppose it didn't. Not really. Labels seemed inadequate for whatever this being truly was. What happens now? I asked the second time that night. Now, it said, I show you what I promised. A secret of the forest, if you're still willing. Everything about the situation screamed danger. Every instinct urged me to retreat, to zip up my tent and pray for morning. But something deeper, that same curiosity that had led me to open the tent in the first place, pushed me forward. I'm willing, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. The entity extended what might have been a hand, a shifting appendage of shadow and light. Then come, walk with me in the rain. Against all better judgment, I stepped out of my tent. The rain immediately soaked through my clothes, but I barely noticed. My attention was fixed on the extraordinary being before me, its form rippling and reforming with each passing second. Follow, it said simply, turning toward the dense forest beyond my campsite. I hesitated only briefly before stepping after it. The ground beneath my feet felt strange, softer than it should be, almost yielding, as if I were walking on something living. The rain continued to fall, but now it seemed to avoid the entity ahead of me, droplets curving around its shifting form. Where are we going? I called out, struggling to keep pace as it moved effortlessly through the undergrowth. To a place between. It replied cryptically, a threshold. You might call it a door, though it leads nowhere and everywhere at once. We walked for what felt like hours, though my watch, when I thought to check it, indicated only minutes had passed. The forest around us grew denser, older. The trees here were massive, their trunks wider than my car, their canopies so thick that despite the rain, the ground beneath was nearly dry. I began to notice changes in my surroundings, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. Flowers that bloomed despite the darkness, their petals emitting a faint phosphorescent glow. Fungi in impossible colors spiraling up tree trunks, the occasional flicker of movement. Creatures that resembled squirrels or foxes but were just slightly wrong, with too many legs or eyes that reflected back impossible colors. What is this place? I whispered, both terrified and awestruck. Lolo Forest. The entity replied simply, the real Lolo Forest, not the sanitized version your park rangers patrol. This is what it was before your kind came, what it still is beneath the surface. We came to a clearing, a perfect circle of open ground perhaps 30 feet across. At its center stood a single tree unlike any I'd ever seen. Its trunk was black as coal, its branches bare of leaves but covered in what looked like tiny blue flames that neither flickered nor seemed to emit heat. We're here, the entity announced, stopping at the edge of clearing. I stared at the tree, mesmerized by its strange beauty. What is it? A pathway, came the reply, or perhaps more accurately, an anchor, something that exists in multiple places at once. I don't understand. The entity made a sound like sighing wind. No, you wouldn't. Your kind thinks in linear terms. One moment following another, one place distinct from the next. But reality is more porous than that, especially in old places like this forest. It gestured toward the tree. Touch it, just once. That's all I ask. Every rational thought screamed against the idea. But I'd come this far, and some part of me knew I would never have this opportunity again. This glimpse into something beyond normal human experience. Slowly, I approached the tree. Up close, I could see that what I'd taken for bark was something else entirely. A surface that seemed to shift and swirl like oil on water. The blue flames danced along the branches, casting an eerie light across the clearing. With a deep breath, I reached out my hand. My fingers hovered just inches from the trunk, and I could feel a strange energy radiating from it. Neither heat nor cold, but something else entirely. What will happen? I asked, my hand trembling. You'll see, the entity said, and you'll remember. I closed my eyes and pressed my palm against the trunk. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming, like plunging into ice water and being burned alive simultaneously. Images flooded my mind. Vast forests stretching across continents, the rise and fall of civilizations. Creatures both familiar and utterly alien moving through landscapes I recognized and those I couldn't possibly comprehend. I saw the forest as it had been thousands of years ago, and as it will be thousands of years hence. I saw things that lived in the spaces between trees, between moments, between thoughts. I saw the entity, my guide, as it truly was, and the knowledge was almost too much to bear. And then, mercifully, darkness. When I came to, I was lying on my back in the clearing, rain falling gently on my face. The entity stood over me, once again in its human-like form. You survived, it said, and I detected something like respect in its voice. Not everyone does. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. What would I see? Everything. Nothing. Fragment of reality your mind could process. Interpretations of truths too vast for human comprehension. It crouched beside me. But you saw and you'll remember. That's what matters. Why me? I asked the question that had been lurking since our first interaction. Why show me these things? The entity was silent for a long moment. When it finally spoke, its voice was softer, almost vulnerable, because we're fading. My kind, the old things. As your world expands, ours contracts. As you forget the ancient ways, we diminish. It gestured to the forest around us. This place is one of the last where we can still manifest fully. One of the last where the boundaries remain thin. But even here, we feel the pressure of your civilization, your disbelief, your forgetting. So this is about preservation. You wanted to tell others about you. A sound escaped it, something between a laugh and a sob. Will anyone believe you? No, this isn't about preservation. It's about bearing witness. One conscious mind acknowledging another before it's too late. The weight of those words settled over me like a physical thing. I was being asked to be the witness to the twilight of beings so ancient they predated human civilization. The thought was humbling, terrifying, and somehow deeply sad. I'll remember, I promised. I won't forget you. The entity nodded, seemingly satisfied. Dawn approaches. I should return you to your camp. The journey back was much quicker than the journey out had been, as if the forest itself had compressed around us. Before I knew it, we were standing before my tent, which looked pathetically ordinary after what I'd experienced. Will I see you again? I asked, subtly reluctant to part ways with my strange guide. Perhaps, it replied, if you return Lolo Forest. If you come alone in the rain, when the barriers are thin. It paused and added, but I wouldn't recommend it. Why not? Because not all who dwell here are as benevolent as I am. Some remember when your kind huddled in caves, fearing the darkness. So I'd like to remind you why. With those chilling words, the entity began to fade, its human form dissolving into the pre-dawn mist that had begun to gather between the trees. "Wait!" I called out. "You never told me your name." A whisper reached me as the last traces of the figure disappeared. "Names have power. Mine is not for your tongue." And then it was gone, leaving me alone beside my tent as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees. The rain had stopped, though droplets still fell from the leaves overhead, a gentle reminder of the night's downpour. I should have been exhausted, but a strange energy hummed through my veins. I packed up my camp methodically, driven by an urgency I couldn't quite explain. All I knew was that I needed to leave, to return to the world of streetlights and mobile phones and other humans. As I shouldered my backpack and took one last look at my campsite, I noticed something on the ground where the entity had stood. A small, perfectly circular stone, midnight black with flecks of blue, that seemed to shift and dance like tiny flames. I picked it up, turning it over my palm. It was warm to the touch despite the morning chill. A parting gift? A reminder? Or perhaps a tether, binding me somehow to what I'd experienced. I slipped it into my pocket and began the hike back to civilization. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't returned to Lolo Forest, though I've thought about it every day since. The stone sits on my bedside table, and sometimes, when the rain falls hard against my window, I could swear those blue flecks glow brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. I've kept my promise. I remember, and now so do you. Sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep with rain pattering against the roof, I wonder, are they listening? Do they know I've shared their secret? And more troublingly, have I somehow thinned the barriers further by spreading belief in their existence? Perhaps you're listening to this from your car, rain drumming on the roof as you drive through darkness. Perhaps you're in bed, safe and warm while a storm rages outside. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I want you to consider something. The next time you walk in a forest and the rain begins to fall and you feel that prickling sensation of being watched, remember that not all eyes are human, and not all that watch are bound by the same rules as we are. And if you ever find yourself in Lolo National Forest during a rainstorm and you hear footsteps circling your camp and a voice asks to come in from the rain, well, what you do next is entirely up to you. But I wouldn't open the tent if I were you. Unless, of course, you're curious. Do you believe in coincidences? Those little moments of chance that seem to align just so? I used to. I used to think that life was largely random, a series of unconnected events that occasionally, through sheer mathematical probability, appeared to form patterns. But after what happened to me in Lolo National Forest last autumn, I'm not so certain anymore. I'm telling you this because I need someone else to know. Someone to understand why I flinch at the sound of rainfall, why I've sold my camping equipment, why I wake up screaming some nights with a taste of soil in my mouth. It began, as these things often do, with a simple decision. I've been working myself to exhaustion, 60-hour weeks, surviving on takeaway and too much coffee. When my doctor warned me about burnout, I finally listened. Get away from it all, she advised. Somewhere with no email, no phone signal, just you and nature. Lolo National Forest seemed perfect, remote enough to force disconnection, but established enough to feel safe for a solo traveler. I'd done my research, packed meticulously, even left my detailed itinerary with a friend. 3 days of hiking, 2 nights camping. A circuit that would take me through some of the most pristine wilderness in the country. The forecast predicted clear skies for the duration of my trip. That should have been my first warning, and the clouds began rolling in as I parked my car at the trailhead. Dark, Heavy clouds that seemed to gather specifically above the forest, while surrounding countryside remained bathed in autumn sunshine. Just a local weather system, I told myself, pulling on my rain jacket. I'd pack for contingencies. A little rain wouldn't ruin my therapeutic retreat. The first few hours were magnificent. The forest in autumn was a tapestry of gold and russet and deep, vibrant green. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the occasional patter of rain against the canopy above created a soothing, ambient soundtrack to my hike. I felt the tension of the past months beginning to loosen its grip on my shoulders. According to my map, there was a designated camping area near a small lake about 8 miles in. Perfect for my first night. I made good time, despite the increasing rainfall, and arrived at the lakeside with a few hours of daylight to spare. That's when I noticed something odd, despite this being a popular spot. At least according to the guidebooks, there wasn't another soul around. No tents, no fellow hikers, just a lake. Still as glass despite the rain now falling steadily upon its surface, and a dense wall of trees surrounding it. I should have found it peaceful. Instead, I felt a creeping unease. There was something too perfect about the stillness of scene, as if the forest were holding its breath, waiting. Nevertheless, I set up camp efficiently, securing my tent against the strengthening wind and collecting firewood before it became too sodden to burn. As darkness approached, I managed to get a small fire going and heated a simple meal of camping stew. The rain eased temporarily, though the sky remained heavy with the promise of more to come. I sat beside my fire, watching the flames dance and try to recapture that sense of tranquility I felt earlier. But something had changed. The forest felt aware. The normal woodland sounds, the rustle of small creatures, the call of birds settling for the night, were absent. There was only the whisper of wind through leaves and the occasional plop of accumulated raindrops falling from branches. "You're being ridiculous," I said aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud and quiet. "This is exactly what you came for. Solitude. Peace." But as darkness fully claimed the forest, peace was the last thing I felt. I tried to focus on the practical. I banked the fire, made sure my food was securely stored away from curious wildlife, and retreated to my tent as the rain began again in earnest. Inside, I switched on my head torch and pulled out my book, a well-thumbed thriller I'd been saving for just this occasion. The rain intensified, drumming against the tent fabric. It should have been a comforting sound, but instead it felt isolating, as if each droplet was another barrier separating me from the rest of the world. I found myself reading the same paragraph over and over, unable to absorb the words as my attention kept being drawn to sounds outside. Was that a footstep? Just the wind? A voice? Merely the rain in the trees? By midnight, I gave up on reading and switched off my light, determined to get some sleep. The darkness inside the tent was absolute, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that silhouetted the trees against my tent wall. I must have drifted off eventually because I woke with a start, disoriented and unsure what had disturbed me. The rain had stopped, and in its place was a silence so complete it felt unnatural. No wind, no insects, nothing. And then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere near the lake. Scrape, thud, scrape, thud, like someone digging. I fumbled for my torch, my heart suddenly racing. The rational part of my brain suggested it might be an animal foraging in the night, but it sounded too regular, too deliberate. With trembling fingers, I unlaced my tent and peered out. The night was clear now, the storm having passed, and nearly full moon bathed the campsite in silver light. The lake was a mirror, reflecting the star-strewn sky, and at its edge, perhaps 50 yards from my tent, was a figure. Even from this distance, I could tell something wasn't right about its proportions. Too tall, too thin, its movements jerky and uncoordinated as it drove what looked like a shovel into the soft earth at the water's edge. I ducked back into my tent, pulse pounding in my ears. This was public land. Other hikers had every right to be here. But at night, digging by the lake, every instinct screamed danger. As quietly as possible, I reached for my phone. No signal, of course. I hadn't expected one. My satellite emergency beacon, and it was meant for life-threatening situations. And while this was unsettling, I wasn't in immediate danger. Not yet. The digging continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I strained my ears, trying to determine what was happening, where the figure might be. A twig snapped closer to my tent. Then another. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the direction of the lake. I held my breath, irrationally convinced that the slightest sound would give away my presence, though my bright orange tent hardly made me inconspicuous. The footsteps stopped just outside. "Hello," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm trying to sleep here." No response, but I could sense someone or something just on the other side of the thin fabric wall. A shadow moved across the moonlit tent surface. "I can see you," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "What do you want?" A sound, then a low, rasping chuckle that raised the hair on my arms. It didn't sound entirely human. "What I've always wanted," came the reply, in a voice like dry leaves rustling. "Company." My mouth went dry. "There's a campsite about 2 miles back toward the trailhead. Probably other hikers there." "But I found you," the voice continued, ignoring my suggestion. "All alone, just like the others." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air ran through me. Others. So many come Olo. So few leave. The shadows shifted, growing larger as if its owner had moved closer to the tent. "Do you know why they call it Olo, traveler?" I didn't answer. I was frantically trying to gauge the distance to my backpack, where my walking poles were strapped, the closest things to weapons I had. "It's an old word," the voice continued, seemingly unbothered by my silence. "From before Europeans came. It means hollow, the hollow place, the empty place." Another of those terrible chuckles. "The hungry place." "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I don't want any trouble. I'll be gone in the morning. First light." "They all say that," came the reply. Such optimism. Without warning, something sharp poked against the tent fabric. Once, twice, testing. I scrambled backward, finally reaching my backpack and yanking a walking pole free. Not much of a defense, but better than nothing. "Leave me alone," I shouted, brandishing the pole. "I have a weapon." That chilling laugh again. "No, little traveler, you have a stick." The tent zipper began to move, slowly pulling upward. I lunged forward, grabbing from inside and holding it down with all my strength. "Go away!" I yelled, panic giving my voice a sharp edge. "Help! Somebody help me!" But I knew there was no one to hear, no one to come running. I was alone with whatever waited outside. The pressure on the zipper subsided. For a moment, I dared to hope my resistance had discouraged my tormentor. Then there was a sound, a horrible ripping noise, as something sharp tore through the side of my tent. I didn't wait to see what would emerge through the opening. I threw myself toward the tent door, frantically unzipping it and tumbling outside. The night air hit me like a slap, cool and damp with the aftermath of rain. I scrambled to my feet, walking pole clutched in white-knuckled hands, and turned to face my pursuer. The figure stood beside my now ruined tent. In the moonlight, I could see it clearly, and the sight drove the breath from my lungs. It had the general shape of a man, 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, a head, but the proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, too jointed, as if it had extra elbows and knees. Its face was a crude approximation of human features, like something molded from clay by inexperienced hands. And its eyes, dear God, its eyes were entirely black, reflecting the moonlight like pools of oil. "What are you?" I whispered, taking an involuntary step backward. The thing cocked its head at an impossible angle. "I am Olo," it said simply, "or rather, a small part of it, a fragment, a servant." "I don't understand," I said, continuing to back away toward the trees. If I could just make it to the trail, perhaps I could outrun this thing, find help, find safety. "Few do," it replied, "until it's too late." It gestured toward the lake with one grotesquely elongated arm. "Would you like to see? Would you like to understand what feeds a forest? Why the trees grow so tall, the flowers bloom so bright?" Despite my terror, I found my gaze drawn to where it pointed. The surface of the lake was no longer mirror smooth. Something was moving beneath it, many somethings, creating ripples that spread across the water. As I watched, transfixed shapes began to emerge. Pale, glistening forms rising from the depths. Dozens of them, human-like, but wrong, just as the creature before me was wrong. Their movements were jerky, puppet-like, as if controlled by unseen strings. With a sick lurch of recognition, I realized they were bodies, human bodies, in various states of decay, animated by some impossible force. Some were relatively intact, recognizable as the men and women they had once been. Others were little more than skeletons held together by scraps of rotting tissue. They emerged from the lake in eerie silence, water streaming from empty eye sockets and gaping mouths. And they were coming toward me, forming a shuffling semicircle that cut off my escape route to the trail. "Do you understand now?" asked the creature, its voice almost gentle. "Olo provides for its own. The forest feeds, and in return, it shelters us, protects us, hides us from your world." I was backing up against a tree line now, the walking pole a useless twig in my shaking hands. "Please," I whispered, "please, I won't tell anyone. I'll leave and never come back. I swear." "Oh, you'll never leave," the thing said with terrible certainty. "But you will come back, again and again, rising when called, serving as we all serve." The corpses were closing in now, forming a tight circle around me. Up close, they were even more horrifying, their flesh greenish and bloated, aquatic plants growing from open wounds, small fish and crustaceans making homes in the cavities of their bodies. "The rain comes," the creature announced, looking up at the sky where clouds were indeed gathering again. "The earth softens. It will be easier this way." As if on cue, fat droplets began to fall, quickly becoming a downpour. The ground beneath my feet, already saturated from the earlier storm, turned instantly to mud. And then they were on me, cold, wet hands grabbing at my clothes, my hair, my skin. I fought wildly, swinging the walking pole, connecting with soft, yielding flesh that broke apart under the impact but did not stop its owner's advance. I screamed until my throat was raw, thrashing against the icy grip of the dead. Their touch burned like frost, numbing my skin wherever they made contact. I could feel myself weakening, my movements becoming sluggish as a bone-deep cold spread through my body, through the press of decomposing bodies. I caught glimpses of the creature, the thing that called itself a servant of Olo. It watched impassively, head still tilted at that unnatural angle, as its minions dragged me toward the lake. The water, when they pulled me into it, was not cold as I expected, but warm, almost body temperature. It parted around me like oil, thick and clinging. I tried to hold my breath as they dragged me under, but a skeletal hand forced my mouth open and the lake poured in. It didn't taste like water. It was earthy mineral with an underlying sweetness that reminded me grotesquely of honey. My lungs burned as they filled, but the pain was strangely distant, as if happening to someone else. As my consciousness began to fade, I had a final, terrible vision. Beneath the lake was not a natural bottom of mud and rock, but a vast, pulsing network of roots or tendrils, organic but not quite plant-like. They glowed with a faint phosphorescence, illuminating the countless bodies tangled within their embrace. Some were ancient, little more than impressions in the organic matter. Others were fresh, their expressions still frozen in final terror. And at the center of this nightmare tableau was something massive, a heart or nucleus from which all the tendrils radiated. It pulsed with sickly light, expanding and contracting like a giant lung. As darkness finally claimed me, I understood. The forest wasn't just a place. It was an entity, a being, and we, the unfortunate wanderers who found ourselves in its domain, were not visitors or intruders. We were food. I shouldn't be alive to tell you this. By all rights, I should be part of that grotesque garden beneath Olo Lake, another puppet to be called forth when the servant needs its army of the dead. But fate, it seems, had other plans. I woke, coughing and retching on the lakeshore. Dawn was breaking. The sky clear and innocent of the previous night's horrors. My clothes were soaked, my skin wrinkled as if I'd spent hours in water. But I was alive, impossibly inexplicably alive. Of my campsite there was no sign, no tent, no backpack, no evidence I'd ever been there. The shoreline where I'd seen the servant digging was smooth and untouched. Had I dreamed it all? Some bizarre hallucination brought on by exhaustion or tainted water. I might have convinced myself of that, if not for two things. First, the strange marks on my body, perfect circles of deadened tissue, each about the size of a 2-pound coin, where the corpse's hands had gripped me. The skin there remains numb to this day, no matter what specialists I consult. Second, the object I found clutched in my hand when I awoke, a small, carved wooden figure, roughly humanoid but with too many joints. Its face a crude approximation of features, exactly like the servant of Olo. I made it back to my car by nightfall, half running, half stumbling along the trail, jumping at every sound. I drove straight to the nearest hospital, where they treated me for hypothermia and mild water inhalation. I told them I'd fallen into the lake while filling my water bottle. They had no reason to doubt me. I didn't tell them about the servant or the corpses or the thing beneath the lake. What would be the point? They'd assume I was delirious, or worse, psychiatric. And perhaps that would be a reasonable conclusion. But I know what I experienced. I know it as surely as I know the rain is falling outside my window as I record this. The same rain that seems to follow me now, appearing whenever I think too long about that night, as if it's listening, watching, reminding me. I've researched Olo Forest since then, Digging through historical records, newspaper archives, online forums for hikers and campers, the statistics are telling, though no one seems to have connected the dots. An average of 3 to 5 people go missing in that forest every year. Not a huge number given the size of the area and the number of visitors, but significant when you realize the pattern. Most disappear during or shortly after rainfall. Some are found, usually dead, drowned in the lake or smaller bodies of water throughout the forest. Many are never found at all. I consider reporting what I saw, but who would believe me? And more frightening still, what if someone did? What if they investigated, sent people into the forest, disturbed whatever ancient horror lives beneath that lake? How many more would it take before its hunger was satisfied? So I keep my silence, save for this recording. A warning, perhaps, to those who might find themselves drawn to Lolo National Forest, or confession, or simply the desperate hope that by sharing this burden, I might somehow lighten it. Because I'm not free of Lolo. Not really. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the tendrils wrapping around my legs, still taste that sickly sweet lake water filling my lungs. And in my dreams, I hear a voice, that dry, rustling voice, whispering that I didn't escape, that no one escapes Lolo, that I was simply released, sent back as a messenger, a lure. The most terrifying part? I feel the pull, an inexplicable urge to return to the forest, especially when it rains, as if something is calling me home. So I leave you with this. If you find yourself near Lolo National Forest and the rain begins to fall, and you feel an odd compulsion to wander among those ancient trees, resist. No matter how strong the urge, no matter how beautiful the forest appears, how peaceful, how welcoming, because it is waiting, it is hungry, and it is patient. After all, what's a few more years to something that is fed for centuries? Can you hear in the rain, the whisper, the invitation? I can, always, and sometimes, God help me, I want to answer. Do you ever wonder what's really happening in those remote places where radio signals don't reach? Those dark patches on the map where your mobile shows no bars, where GPS devices struggle to triangulate your position. I used to think it was just a matter of infrastructure. Too far from cell towers, too many mountains or trees blocking the signals. But after what happened to me in Lolo National Forest, I've come to believe there might be another explanation. Something actively interfering. Something that doesn't want us to connect with the outside world. I'm a sound engineer. I work primarily in film and television, recording ambient noise, capturing clean dialogue, mixing audio tracks. I'm the person who makes sure that when an actor whispers a crucial line, you can hear it perfectly despite the background explosion. It's technical work, precise work. I deal in facts, in measurable frequencies and decibel levels. Or at least I used to. Last spring, I was contracted to collect wilderness ambient sounds for a nature documentary series. The director wanted authentic forest audio, not just the generic stuff from sound libraries, but real immersive soundscapes from specific locations. One of those locations was Lolo National Forest, chosen for its reputation as one of the last truly pristine woodland areas in the country. I planned a 3-day recording expedition. Nothing extreme. I'm no survivalist, just someone who appreciates nature and knows how to operate a digital recorder in the field. I booked a cabin at the edge of the forest, packed my equipment, and set out one Friday afternoon in early May. The cabin was exactly what you'd expect, rustic, isolated, with just enough amenities to be comfortable without spoiling the wilderness experience. The elderly caretaker who handed me the keys seemed surprised when I told him I was staying alone. Most folks bring someone with them, he remarked, his weathered face creasing with concern, especially this time of year, with the rains coming. I assured him I'd be fine. I'd done solo recording trips before, and I liked the solitude. It made for cleaner audio without human whispers or movements contaminating the natural sounds. Well, he said, handing me a hand-drawn map along with the keys. If you're set on going in deep, stick to the marked trails. And if it starts to rain heavy, head back right away. The streams flood quick here, and it's easy to turn around. I thanked him for the advice, though privately I thought he was being a bit dramatic. The forecast mentioned only a slight chance of scattered showers, nothing that would cause dangerous flooding. That first evening, I stayed close to the cabin, setting up smaller recording rigs around the perimeter to capture the forest sounds at dusk, the changing of shifts, as we call in the industry, when daytime creatures bed down and nocturnal ones emerge. The results were promising. Crystal clear audio of owls beginning their night hunt, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, the last calls of songbirds before darkness fell completely. But it was a deeper forest I really needed to access, the truly untouched areas where human sounds, distant traffic, airplanes overhead, other hikers, wouldn't interfere. According to my research and the map the caretaker had provided, there was a particularly remote valley about 4 miles from the cabin, far from any roads or regular hiking trails, perfect for capturing pristine audio. I set out at dawn the next morning, carrying my most sensitive equipment in a padded backpack, along with water, energy bars, and rain gear, just in case the caretaker's warning proved prescient. The hike was pleasant, though more strenuous than I'd anticipated. The trail gradually became less defined as I moved deeper into the forest, until I was essentially forging my own path, guided by the map and occasional landmarks. By mid-morning, I reached the valley. It was everything I'd hoped for, a lush depression in the landscape, ringed by ancient trees, with a small stream trickling through its center. Birds called overhead, insects hummed in the underbrush, and the stream provided a gentle liquid soundtrack beneath it all. A sound engineer's paradise. I set up my primary recording rig first, a high-end binaural microphone system that captures audio the way human ears perceive it, creating a three-dimensional sound experience when played back through headphones. Then I placed smaller recorders at strategic points around the valley, each focused on capturing different elements of the soundscape. With everything in place, I settled down on a fallen log, plugged my headphones into the main recorder, and listened. The forest came alive in my ears. Every rustling leaf, every distant bird call, the complex harmonics of the wind through branches. Perfect, clean audio. Or it was until about noon when I first noticed the anomaly. It was subtle at first, a faint interference in the lower frequencies, the kind of thing most people would never notice, but to a trained sound engineer, it stood out like a wrong note in a familiar melody. I adjusted my equipment, thinking it might be a technical issue, perhaps moisture affecting the microphones or battery levels dropping, but the interference remained. In fact, it seemed to be growing stronger. I switched to different recorders, checking each one in turn. The anomaly was present in all of them, ruling out a simple equipment malfunction. It was a consistent low-frequency hum, just below the threshold of what an average person might consciously perceive, but definitely there a vibration more felt than heard, like the distant rumble of a lorry engine, except we were miles from any road. As I focused on the sound, trying to identify its source, I became aware of how the forest had changed around me. The bird calls had stopped. The insects had fallen silent. Even the stream seemed to be flowing more quietly. as if reluctant to compete with that strange, pulsing hum. I checked the sky, half expecting to see storm clouds gathering. Low-pressure systems can sometimes create odd acoustic phenomena, but the sky was clear blue, with just a few wispy clouds drifting lazily overhead. The rational part of my brain suggested I might be picking up some man-made interference, perhaps a remote research station with generators or military installations using low-frequency communications. But a quick check of my map showed no structures marked within miles. I decided to try triangulating the source of the sound. Using a directional microphone, I slowly rotated in a complete circle, noting where the interference was strongest. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the valley, toward a dense cluster of particularly old, gnarled trees. Professional curiosity overcoming caution, I packed up my main recording rig and headed in that direction, leaving the smaller recorders running in their original positions. As I moved, the hum grew more distinct. It was no longer just a feeling, but an audible pulse, a repeating pattern of vibrations that seemed almost deliberate. The trees grew thicker as I approached, their ancient trunks twisted into shapes that seemed almost anatomical, like frozen bodies, contorted in pain or ecstasy. Moss and lichen covered them in leprous patches, and the ground beneath was surprisingly clear of underbrush, as if nothing could grow in their shadow. At the center of this strange grove was a small clearing, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, and in the center of the clearing was a depression in the earth. Not quite a hole, more like the ground had been pressed down by some enormous weight, creating a shallow bowl shape. The hum was coming from there, directly from the ground itself. I approached cautiously, my directional mic extended before me like a dowsing rod. The interference was so strong now that it was causing feedback in my headphones, forcing me to lower the volume. When I reached the edge of the depression, I crouched down for a closer look. The soil was different here, darker, almost black, with an odd sheen to it that reminded me of oil on water. And it was moving, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but definitely moving, pulsing in perfect sync with the hum. Scientific curiosity compelled me to touch it. As soon as my fingers made contact with the soil, the hum changed pitch, rising slightly, becoming more complex, almost like a chord rather than a single note. And I felt something, a presence, an awareness, as if the earth itself had suddenly taken notice of me. I recoiled, wiping my hand on my jeans. The soil had left a residue. Not dirt exactly, but a fine, glistening powder that seemed to shimmer between black and deep purple in the dappled sunlight. That's when I noticed my hand was numb where it had touched the soil. Not the pins and needles numbness of restricted circulation, but a complete absence of sensation, as if that part of my skin had been anesthetized. Alarmed, I backed away from depression. As I did so, the hum changed again, lower now and faster, like a bass line picking up tempo. The vibration intensified, and I could feel it through my boots, reverberating up through my bones. The air in the clearing seemed to thicken, becoming hazy with what looked like dust motes dancing in the sunlight, except they moved with purpose, swirling into patterns too regular to be random. And then I heard it, beneath the hum, almost subliminal. Stay. Not a voice, not exactly. More like the idea of a word, pressed directly into my consciousness. I yanked off my headphones, thinking it might be some bizarre feedback effect, but the impression remained stronger now. Stay. Listen. Join. My heart rate doubled. I was hallucinating. Had to be. Perhaps the soil contained some kind of toxic fungal spores or natural psychotropic compounds that would explain everything: the numbness, the auditory hallucinations, the strange visual effects. I needed to leave. Now, I turned to go, but something made me hesitate, a compulsion to look back at the depression one last time. The soil was moving more vigorously now, rippling like the surface of a liquid rather than solid earth, and it was rising, forming a shape, a human shape. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that scientific curiosity overcame fear, but that would be a lie. I ran, dropped my directional mic, abandoned thousands of pounds worth of equipment, and flat out sprinted back the way I'd come. I didn't slow down until I reached the spot where I'd left my other recorders. I gathered them quickly, hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the power switches. The entire time, I could feel the hum following me, not diminishing with distance as it should have, but maintaining its intensity, like it was somehow locked onto me personally. As I finished packing the last recorder, the first fat droplets of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it was a downpour, the kind of sudden, violent storm that seems to appear from nowhere in forest environments. The rain hammered through the canopy, instantly soaking me despite my hasty attempt to don rain gear. I set off toward the cabin at a jog, my pack bouncing uncomfortably against my back. The trail that had been merely faint on the way in now seemed to be actively disappearing under the onslaught of rain, mud and water obscuring whatever markers I'd been following. And all the while, that hum continued, no longer behind me, but all around, as if the entire forest was vibrating at that same impossible frequency. With the rain came a mist, reducing visibility to mere yards. Trees loomed out of the grayness like sentinels, each one seeming oddly deliberate in its placement, as if they were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. I checked my compass, trying to maintain a straight line back toward the cabin, but the needle was spinning wildly, rendering it useless. My phone, which I brought despite knowing there would be no signal, showed similar confusion, the GPS unable to locate me, the screen occasionally glitching with strange patterns that resembled the ripples I'd seen in that disturbed soil. I was lost. The reality of it hit me like a physical blow. Lost in a forest I didn't know, in a worsening storm, with night only a few hours away, and something aware, something that could communicate, knew exactly where I was. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I forced myself to stop, to breathe, to think logically. Water flows downhill. The cabin was at a lower elevation than the valley. If I followed the slope of the land, I should eventually reach it, or at least find one of the main trails. I set off again, more carefully now, paying close attention to the terrain. But the forest seemed to be actively working against me. Paths that appeared promising would end abruptly at fallen trees or sudden ravines. The slope of the land would reverse unexpectedly, leading me back uphill when I knew I needed to go down. And that hum, that endless pulsing hum, was changing, evolving, becoming more complex, more layered, almost musical, but in a way that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. As daylight began to fade, I made a decision. I needed shelter, not just from the rain, but from whatever was happening in this forest. I found a relatively dry spot beneath a rocky overhang and began gathering materials to build a rudimentary lean-to. My hands were still numb where I touched that strange soil, making the work clumsy and slow. By the time darkness fell completely, I had a barely adequate shelter and had changed into the spare clothes from my pack. I was still damp, still cold, but no longer in immediate danger of hypothermia. I had water, energy bars, a small flashlight. I could survive the night. But as I sat there, listening to the rain drumming on my makeshift roof, I became increasingly certain that exposure wasn't the greatest threat I faced. The hum had changed again. Now it seemed to be forming patterns, repeating sequences that nagged at my mind like a half-remembered song. And accompanying it were new visual phenomena, flashes of light in the forest that corresponded to specific tones within the hum, like a visual equalizer displaying frequencies, but spread throughout the trees. I huddled deeper into my inadequate shelter, trying to convince myself it was all explainable. Stress, exhaustion, perhaps mild hypothermia causing hallucinations. But a deeper part of me knew better. What I was experiencing wasn't a breakdown of my senses, but rather an expansion of them, as if I were being tuned like an instrument to perceive something normally beyond human awareness. I must have dozed off despite my fear, because I woke with a start to absolute silence. The rain had stopped, the wind had died, and most disturbingly, the hum had ceased entirely. But something was moving in the forest, something large. I switched on my flashlight, its beam pathetically small against the vast darkness. For a long moment, I saw nothing unusual, just trees, rocks, the glistening aftermath of rain. Then movement caught my eye, a shifting of shadows at the edge of my light's reach. I focused the beam there, and immediately wished I hadn't. It was humanoid, roughly, in the way a child's clay figure might resemble a person. The basic form correct, but the proportions all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its skin, if it could be called skin, had that same oily black sheen as the soil from the depression, and it seemed to absorb my flashlight's beam rather than reflect it, creating a person-shaped hole in the night. But worst of all was its face, or rather, where its face should have been. Instead, there was a complex pattern of ripples, constantly in motion, like the surface of a pond disturbed by countless tiny impacts. And from these ripples emanated a hum, now visible as well as audible, sending out concentric waves of distortion in the very fabric of reality around it. I remained perfectly still, not daring to breathe. Some primitive instinct told me that movement would draw its attention, that perhaps, if I was motionless enough, it might not perceive me. The creature took a step forward, a liquid, flowing motion that seemed to pay little heed to the constraints of skeletal structure. Then another. It was moving toward me with the unhurried confidence of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. As it approached, the hum intensified, resonating painfully in my skull, and with it came those not-quite words again, pressing into my mind. Found you. Join us. Become frequency. The last vestiges of scientific rationality crumbled in the face of this impossibility. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a misunderstood natural phenomenon. It was other, fundamentally different from anything I had categories for. When it was perhaps 10 feet from my shelter, I broke. Self-preservation overrode terror, and I scrambled backwards, abandoning my lean-to, my backpack. Everything but the flashlight still clutched in my shaking hand. The creature paused, its rippling non-face seeming to register surprise. Then it emitted a new sound, a high, keening wail that bore the same relationship to the hum as a scream does to breathing. It was a hunting call, and it was answered. From all around came similar wails, 2, 3, a dozen, impossible to count. The forest was full of these things. I ran, blindly, desperately, with no direction in mind beyond a way. My flashlight beam bounced crazily off trees and rocks, creating a nightmarish strobe effect that made the forest seem to move around me. Behind, the wailing rose to a fever pitch, a chorus of inhuman voices unified in pursuit. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost meaning, compressed into a singular experience of terror and exertion. My lungs burned, my legs screamed with pain, but stopping was unthinkable, because the sounds behind me never faded. If anything, they grew closer. Then my foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. My flashlight flew from my hand, its beam briefly illuminating a scene from Nightmare. Multiple elongated silhouettes converging on my position, their rippling non-faces catching the light like oil slicks. In that moment, I knew I was going to die, or worse, become like them, another frequency in their inhuman chorus. But as I struggled to rise, my hand fell upon something unexpected. Rough, aged wood, a step, and beyond it, another, a staircase in the middle of the forest, leading up to a porch, a cabin porch. Somehow, in my blind panic, I had run directly back to my rented cabin. I scrabbled up the steps on all fours, fumbling for the keys in my pocket as I reached the door. Behind me, the wailing reached a crescendo, and I could feel the vibration of multiple humming entities converging on the small clearing around the cabin. The key slid home, the lock turned, and I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me just as something heavy thudded against it from the other side. I backed away, watching in horror as the door shuddered under repeated impacts. But it held, whatever these entities were. They seemed unable or unwilling to pass the cabin's threshold. The attacks on the door ceased, but I could sense them still out there, moving around the cabin, probing, searching for a way in. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with their collective hum, and strange patterns of shadow and light played across the ceiling, cast by no discernible source. For hours, they laid siege to the cabin. Occasionally, one would press what passed for a face against a window, that rippling non-visage distorted further by the glass. The hum would intensify when this happened, boring into my skull with renewed attempts at communication. Join, become, resonate, forever. I huddled in the center of the main room, as far from the windows and doors as possible, hands pressed over my ears in a futile attempt to block out those invasive, almost words. Near dawn, the assault began to wane. The hum receded. The shadows withdrew from the windows, and the oppressive sense of being surrounded gradually lifted. By the time the first gray light of morning filtered through the trees, there was no sign of my nocturnal tormentors. I waited until full daylight before venturing outside, half convinced they would still be there, lurking just out of sight. But the clearing around the cabin was empty, just wet grass and muddy patches where the rain had pooled. I threw my few belongings into my car and left immediately, not even bothering to check out properly. I simply left the key on the kitchen table and fled. The entire drive back to the city, I kept checking my rear-view mirror, convinced I would see those elongated silhouettes emerging from the tree-line behind me. When I reached home, I immediately began reviewing the recordings from the equipment I had managed to save. Most contained nothing unusual, just standard forest ambience. But one, positioned closest to where I'd encountered the strange oppression in the earth, had captured something. Beneath the usual forest sounds was a hum, faint at first, but growing stronger as the recording progressed. When played through good speakers, it created a strange effect in the room. Areas where the sound seemed to cancel itself out entirely, and others were intensified to almost painful levels. But more disturbing was what happened when I ran the recording through spectral analysis software, which visualized the sound frequencies as images. There, hidden in the complex harmonics of the hum, was a pattern, a face, not human, not animal, but unmistakably a face, with the same rippling, fluid quality I'd seen in the forest editing. I deleted the recording immediately, smashed the memory card for good measure, but it was too late. The hum had found a home in my mind. Even now, months later, I hear it sometimes, usually at night or when it rains. A complex, pulsing frequency just below the threshold of normal hearing. And sometimes, in those moments between wakefulness and sleep, I feel myself beginning to ripple, as if my very atoms are trying to resonate with some distant call. I haven't returned to Lolo National Forest. I've turned down good, paying jobs that would take me anywhere near it. I've even stopped working with certain frequency ranges entirely. Those low, thrumming bass tones that remind me too much of what I heard in that clearing. But sometimes I wonder if distance really matters. If something capable of turning sound into a doorway, of reshaping reality through vibration, is really limited by something as mundane as geography. So I've started recording myself when I sleep and reviewing the footage in the morning. So far, nothing unusual has appeared. But last night, for the first time, there was a brief segment, just a few seconds, where the audio dropped out entirely. Complete silence. And in that moment, watching my sleeping form on the screen, I could swear I saw a ripple pass across my face. Tonight, it's raining again. A steady, drumming rhythm on my roof that sounds almost like a code or an invitation. Can you hear it too? That low, pulsing hum beneath the rain? That frequency that seems to resonate with something deep in your bones? No, perhaps it's just me. Then, for now, I've never told anyone the full story of what happened during my search and rescue operation in Lolo National Forest. There's the official report, of course, the one file with the ranger station and the local sheriff's department. But that version is sanitized, logical, acceptable. It doesn't include the things I can't explain, the things no one would believe. Until now, I've kept those details to myself. But I can't sleep most nights. The rain especially keeps me awake. That gentle tapping against the windows that reminds me too much of what I heard in those woods. So perhaps sharing this burden might ease it. Even if you think I'm simply spinning a campfire tale. I've been part of the volunteer search and rescue team covering Lolo National Forest for 11 years. It's remote country, dense woodland, steep ravines, winding streams that become raging torrents after heavy rain. Beautiful, but unforgiving to the unprepared or the unlucky. We get called out about 15 times a year, usually for hikers who strayed off marked trails or twisted an ankle mile from the nearest road. Most operations end well. We find a lost hiker, treat any injuries, and guide them back to civilization. Sometimes there are complications. Exposure, dehydration, the occasional broken bone requiring a stretcher evacuation. Rarely, very rarely, we find only a body, and sometimes we find nothing at all. Jason Chun was one of these nothing-at-all cases, at least officially. 28 years old, experienced hiker, proper equipment, sensible itinerary that he'd filed with a ranger station before setting out. He was supposed to complete a 3-day loop trail, checking in at designated points along the way. When he missed his second check-in, the Rangers alerted our team. It was early October, that perfect time when the forest transitions to its autumn splendor. The weather had been fair, but a storm system was moving in. Nothing extreme, just the usual autumn rains. We needed to find Jason before those rains hit, and potentially wash away any tracks or other evidence of his passage. I was assigned to lead one of 4 search teams. My group would cover the northeastern section of the loop trail, including a particularly remote area known as Holloway Ridge. It's challenging terrain, dense undergrowth, rocky outcroppings, plenty of places where a person could lose their footing or become disoriented. Perfect search and rescue territory. In other words, my team consisted of myself, two other experienced SAR volunteers, Mike and Diane, and a ranger named Keith who knew that section of forest particularly well. We set out at dawn, equipped with the usual gear: first aid kits, communications equipment, provisions for ourselves and potentially for Jason if we found him in a state of need. The first few hours were standard procedure. We followed the main trail, calling Jason's name at regular intervals, looking for any signs of disturbance that might indicate someone had left the path. Keith led us to the areas where hikers most commonly get into trouble: a misleading fork in the trail, a section where erosion had obscured the proper route. Nothing. No response to our calls, no disturbed vegetation, no discarded equipment. It was as if Jason had simply vanished from the designated trail. By mid-afternoon, all 4 search teams had reported similar findings, or rather, a similar lack of findings. It was puzzling. Even if Jason had become severely injured or, worse, we should have found some trace of him along the established route. That's when the coordinator made the decision to expand the search area. Each team would move outside the main trail system, focusing on areas where a disoriented hiker might wander. My team was directed to check a section of Holloway Ridge that contained several natural rock formations, caves and overhangs where someone might seek shelter. We were about an hour into this expanded search when the storm arrived. It moved in with surprising speed, the sky darkening from light gray to slate in minutes. The rain began as a gentle patter on the canopy above, but quickly intensified to a proper downpour. Visibility dropped, and the forest floor turned slick with mud and wet leaves. "We should think about heading back," Keith suggested, raising his voice over the drumming rain. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." I was inclined to agree, but just as I was about to call it, Diane spotted something, a flash of color out of place among the natural browns and greens of the forest. We approached carefully and found a small marker flag, the kind hikers sometimes used to mark their path in confusing terrain. It was bright orange, clearly artificial and relatively new. "Could be Jason's," Mike said, examining it closely, "or could be from any hiker who's passed through recently. Worth following up." I decided, let's see if there are more. There were. Another orange flag about 50 yards further on, placed in a similar manner, and another beyond that. They created a trail leading away from any established path, deeper into a particularly dense section of woods that rose toward one of the ridge's steep slopes. "This doesn't make sense," Keith said, frowning at his map. "There's nothing up this way. No trails, no notable landmarks. Just rough country all the way to the ridge top. Maybe you saw something you wanted to photograph?" Diane suggested. "A rare bird or plant specimen?" "In this direction specifically?" Keith shook his head. "It's just more trees, more underbrush. Nothing special." Despite Keith's skepticism, we continued following the flags. The rain intensified, running in rivulets down the increasingly steep slope we were climbing. The ground became treacherous, slippery clay that sucked at our boots with each step. But the flags continued, placed with meticulous regularity. "Jason must have really wanted to reach whatever's up there," Mike commented, breathing heavily from the climb. "This is not casual wandering. This is purposeful." I nodded, though a sense of unease had begun to build in my stomach. Something about the precision of those markers, the deliberate path they created through such difficult terrain, felt wrong somehow. Not like the actions of someone lost or confused, but not like normal hiking behavior either. We had followed perhaps 10 or 12 flags when we came upon a small clearing. Unlike the dense forest surrounding it, this space of about 30 feet in diameter was oddly open. No underbrush, no fallen logs, just bare earth dotted with mushrooms growing in an almost perfect circle. "A fairy ring," Diane said, pointing to the mushrooms. "That's what my grandmother would have called it. Just a natural fungal growth pattern, Keith countered, though he eyed the clearing with obvious discomfort. Nothing mystical about it. At the center of this clearing was another orange flag, but this one was different. Instead of being stuck into ground on its thin metal pole, it had been carefully laid flat, pointing toward the far side of the clearing where the ground rose sharply toward the ridge's peak. We approached cautiously. The rain had transformed the bare earth of the clearing into mud that squelched unpleasantly beneath our boots. When we reached the central flag, I crouched down to examine it more closely. That's when I noticed the writing. On the orange plastic of the flag, almost invisible against the bright color, someone had written a single word with what looked like a fine-tipped marker. Below what? Mike asked, peering over my shoulder. Before anyone could speculate, Diane called out from the edge of the clearing. Over here, there's some kind of entrance. We joined her at what appeared to be a narrow opening in the rising ground. Not quite a cave, more like a crevice where two large rocks had shifted apart, creating a gap just wide enough for a person to slip through sideways. Another orange flag was placed directly in front of this opening. This wasn't on any of our maps, Keith said, an edge of professional annoyance in his voice. I should know about any caves or significant geological features in my section. I shined my flashlight into the gap. The beam illuminated a rough-walled passage that seemed to descend at a gentle angle into the earth. The air flowing out felt noticeably cooler than the surrounding forest, carrying a damp mineral smell. Jason, I called into the opening. Jason Chin, if you're in there, call out or make a noise. Only silence answered him, though the acoustics of the passage carried my voice surprisingly far, suggesting it opened into a larger space beyond. He could have sought shelter from the rain, Diane suggested. If he was already out here when the storm front moved in, it was a reasonable theory, though it didn't explain the deliberately placed trail of flags leading to the specific location. What had drawn Jason here in the first place? I'll go in first, I decided, already removing my larger backpack and keeping only essential gear in my smaller waist pack. Diane, you follow. Mike and Keith, hold position here in case we need to make a quick exit, or in case Jason returns while we're searching. Keith looked relieved at not having to enter the mysterious opening, while Mike merely nodded, his expression serious. Diane and I switched our flashlights to their brightest settings, checked our radios, and approached the entrance. The passage was a tight fit, even for someone of my relatively slim build. We had to turn sideways and shuffle through about 10 feet of narrow, twisting space before it suddenly opened into a much larger chamber. My flashlight couldn't even reach the far wall or ceiling. The beam simply faded into darkness. This is incredible, Diane whispered beside me, her voice echoing slightly. How is this not on any survey map? I swept my light across what I could see of the chamber. The floor was relatively flat, composed of the same rock as the walls but worn smooth, as if by water flow over centuries. Small stalactites descended from what I could glimpse of the ceiling. It was a proper cave system, and a significant one at that. Jason? I called again, my voice bouncing back from multiple directions. We're with search and rescue. If you can hear me, please respond. The echoes faded into silence. Then, just as I was about to suggest we move further in, we heard it. A sound like a stone being dropped into water coming from deeper within the cave. A single, distinct plop. Did you hear that? Diane whispered. I nodded, directed my light toward where I thought the sound had originated. Jason, is that you? Another sound answered, not a plop this time, but a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on a hard surface, but muffled, distant. That's not natural, Diane said, her professional calm giving way to obvious unease. That's deliberate. She was right. The rhythm was too regular, too controlled to be water dripping or rock settling. It was communication, or at least It was meant to sound like communication. "We should investigate," I said, though without much conviction. Everything about the situation felt wrong. The unmarked cave, the deliberate trail of flags leading specifically here, the responsive tapping when we called out. We advanced cautiously, our flashlight beams creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the stone walls. The chamber narrowed into a corridor that descended more steeply, the floor becoming increasingly damp. I could hear water running somewhere ahead, not a dramatic underground river, but the gentle gurgle of a small stream. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder as we advanced. It maintained the same rhythm. 3 quick taps, pause. 2 slow taps, pause, repeat. Over and over, with mechanical precision. The corridor opened into a second chamber, smaller than the first, but still significant. And here, the source of the water sound became clear. A narrow stream emerged from a crack in one wall, crossed the chamber floor in a shallow channel, and disappeared into another opening. Our flashlights caught something reflective near this stream, something that didn't belong in this underground world, something manufactured, a camera, a high-end digital camera mounted on a small tripod, positioned to point directly at the stream. Next to it lay a notebook, its pages darker with moisture but still intact, and a pen. "Jason's?" Diane asked, though we both knew it had to be. Who else would have brought photography equipment to this hidden place? I approached carefully, conscious of the unstable ground near the stream's edge. The camera was still on, its battery indicator showing about half charge. I pressed the playback button, and the screen illuminated with the last image taken. It showed the stream, but with something in it, something partially submerged, breaking the water surface with what looked like a hand. I couldn't be sure. The image was dark, the flash having created harsh shadows that obscured details. I checked the timestamp. The photo had been taken just over 24 hours ago. "Check the notebook," I said to Diane, trying to keep my voice steady. She picked it up gingerly, opening to a page marked with a folded corner. "It's a journal entry," she said, angling it toward her flashlight. "Dated yesterday." She began to read. "October 12th. Found it again. The entrance was different this time, further east than last month, and hidden between those distinctive split rocks. They move it, I'm certain now. They don't want just anyone to find their way in." She looked up at me, confused. "He's been here before?" I gestured for her to continue. The flags worked as they promised. Follow the trail and speak the words, and the way opens. I brought the offering as instructed. Silver coins, just like in the old stories. I've left them by the stream where I saw the hand last time. Maybe tonight they'll let me see more. Maybe tonight I'll get the proof I need. Diane's voice faltered. "What is he talking about? What proof?" Before I could respond, the tapping resumed, louder now, and seemingly coming from directly behind us, from the corridor we had just traversed. We both spun around, flashlights sweeping the darkness. Nothing visible, but the tapping continued, its rhythm unchanged. 3 quick, 2 slow, pause, repeat. "We should call Mike and Keith," Diane said, reaching for her radio. "Get backup in here." She pressed the transmit button, but instead of the usual static, a high-pitched whine emanated from the speaker, the sound of some powerful interference. She switched channels, tried again, the same electronic shriek. "No signal," she said unnecessarily. "We're too far underground." Or something was actively blocking it. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome. We should go back, I decided. Bring the camera and notebook. Report what we found. Diane nodded emphatically, already gathering Jason's belongings. As she picked up the camera, the tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound both more mundane and more terrifying. Footsteps. Wet, shuffling footsteps, approaching from the corridor. We froze, flashlights trained on the chamber entrance. The footsteps drew closer, accompanied now by a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone humming a tuneless melody or moaning very quietly. "Jason?" I called, my voice embarrassingly thin. "Is that you, Jason?" The footsteps paused. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater, bubbling, distorted, barely recognizable as human, came a response. "Not Jason anymore." A figure appeared in the corridor entrance, in the harsh light of our flashlights. Its appearance made no sense. It had the general shape of a man, wore what might have been hiking clothes, but its proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, torso too thin, and its skin glistened wetly, not like it was covered in water, but as if it was partially composed of water, its surface tension barely containing something that should be liquid. The face was the worst part. It had Jason's features. I recognized them from the photograph we'd been given, but they were fluid, shifting subtly like ripples across a disturbed pond. Only the eyes remained stable, and they were entirely black, reflecting our flashlight beams like polished obsidian. "What happened to you?" Diane whispered, unconsciously backing away. The thing that had been Jason tilted its head at an angle no human neck should permit. "I paid the toll," it said in that terrible bubbling voice. "I saw what lives below, what has always lived below." Its mouth stretched into a smile far too wide for its face. "They're hungry now, hungry for more than coins." It took a step toward us. As it moved, I noticed something horrifying. Its feet weren't touching the ground fully. They partially merged with it, like wax melting into wax, leaving no distinct separation between flesh and stone. "We can help you," I said automatically, falling back on my search and rescue training despite the impossible situation. "We can get you out of here, get you medical attention." The thing laughed, a wet, gurgling sound like a drain backing up. "Help? No help needed. I am becoming part of Olo." It gestured toward the stream with one elongated arm. "They're waiting for you, in the water. They want to show you too." As if on cue, the stream surface broke, not with bubbles or ripples, but with dozens of reaching appendages, pale, glistening things that resembled human fingers, but were too long, too flexible, moving with the sinuous grace of underwater plants. "Run," I said to Diane, all pretense of professional calm abandoned. "Run." We bolted for the corridor, but the Jason thing moved with shocking speed, flowing more than running to block our path. Up close, the wrongness of it was even more apparent. Its body seemed to be slowly dissolving, merging with the cave atmosphere itself, wisps of its form evaporating like steam. "The toll must be paid," it said, reaching for us with hands that dripped and reformed continuously. "A fair exchange. One stays so one may leave." Behind us, the finger-like appendages were emerging further from the stream, revealing hands, arms, eventually torsos, a small army of partial figures, all exhibiting the same fluid, unstable properties as the Jason thing. They pulled themselves onto the chamber floor with horrible, squelching sounds. In that moment of pure terror, I made a decision I'll always question. I shoved Diane hard, sending her stumbling past the Jason thing while it was focused on me. "Go!" I shouted. "Get help!" The creature turned toward her retreating form, but seemed unable or unwilling to pursue beyond a certain distance from the stream. It turned back to me, its liquid features settling into an expression of what might have been amusement. Noble, it burbled, but unnecessary. "The toll is already paid." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, trying to edge toward the corridor myself while the thing was talking. The water entities had almost reached me, their cold, damp presence palpable against my back. The Jason thing pointed toward the notebook Diane had dropped in her flight. The words, it said, the invitation, spoken aloud is acceptance. Its terrible smile widened. You read, you called, you consented with shocking clarity. I remember Diane reading from a journal, the entry about following flags, speaking the words, the way opening. Had that been some kind of ritual? Some kind of invocation? That's insane, I said, though to whom I was arguing, the creature or myself, I couldn't say. Reading something aloud isn't consent. That's not how anything works. It's how we work, the thing replied simply. The old ways, the true ownership of old. The water entities have formed a loose circle around me now, their partially formed bodies swaying gently, as if still subject to underwater currents despite being in open air. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice steadier than I would have expected given the circumstances. Just a little piece, the Jason thing said, reaching toward me with a hand that was now barely recognizable as human, more like a tentacle ending in too many wriggling digits. A small piece to add to our collection, to our chorus. It touched my chest, and the sensation was beyond description. Cold yet burning, solid yet permeable, as if something was passing through my skin, my muscles, directly into the core of me. I tried to scream, but no sound emerged. In that moment of contact, I saw, or rather, experienced what Jason had seen, what had transformed him, the true nature of what lived beneath Lolo Forest, an ancient presence, vast beyond comprehension, distributed throughout the underground water system like a nervous system, not a single entity, but a colony, a collective, each individual, like the thing surrounding me, merely a specialized cell in a greater organism. It had been there for millennia, occasionally reaching out, occasionally taking, always watching. And it was hungry, not for flesh or blood in conventional sense, but for consciousness, for experiences, for the unique patterns of thought and memory that made up a human mind. It consumed these, added them to its collective, preserved fragment of identity while dissolving others. Jason hadn't been its first meal. There were others, dozens, perhaps hundreds over the centuries. Lost hikers, vanished travelers, all becoming notes in its vast, incomprehensible song. The vision, if that's what it was, ended as abruptly as it had begun. The Jason thing withdrew its touch, and I collapsed to my knees, gasping. Now you see, it said. Now you understand. I did understand, though I wished desperately that I didn't. And with understanding came the certainty that I would not leave this cave, not as the person I had entered it. But then, unexpectedly, salvation arrived in the form of voices, human voices, echoing from the corridor. And here, I found way back in. It was Diane, and she wasn't alone. Multiple flashlight beams cut through the darkness, accompanied by the reassuring sounds of my fellow search and rescue team members. The water entities reacted immediately, retreating toward the stream with surprising speed. The Jason thing gave me one last, long look, its features now so fluid that they barely held any human resemblance at all. We'll be waiting, it said, its voice fading like the last bubbles of a drowning man. The toll is merely delayed. Then it too flowed back toward the water, its form dissolving and merging with the stream in a way that defied physics. By the time Mike, Keith, and two rangers I didn't recognize burst into the chamber with Diane, there was no sign of the entities, just a quietly burbling stream and a very shaken search and rescue leader. What happened? Mike demanded, helping me to my feet. Diane said, you found something. Evidence of Jason? I looked at Diane, saw the fear and confusion in her eyes. She had seen the Jason thing, heard its impossible voice. But had she seen the water entities? Had she witnessed what happened when it touched me? Her expression gave nothing away. We found his camera, I said, pointing to where it lay on the ground, and a journal. but no definitive sign of Jason himself. The lie came easily necessary. I slipped near the stream, had a bit of a shock. I'm fine now. The others seemed to accept this, though Diane's gaze remained troubled. We gathered Jason's belongings and made our way out of the cave system, emerging into the forest where the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind that distinctive after-storm freshness in the air. The official search continued for 2 more days before being scaled back and eventually suspended. Jason Chin was officially classified as missing, presumed dead, another statistic in the annals of wilderness disappearances. His camera and journal were logged as evidence, though I made sure certain pages of that journal, the ones detailing his previous visits, the instruction he had followed, were accidentally damaged beyond legibility. I told myself it was to prevent others from finding that cave, from speaking those words, from paying that terrible toll. But deep down, I knew it was also to protect myself, from questions I couldn't answer, from judgments about my mental stability. Because how do you explain to your colleagues, to the authorities, to the grieving family, that the missing hiker isn't missing at all, that he's still there, in a sense, transformed into something that isn't quite alive but certainly isn't dead, part of a collective consciousness that has existed beneath the forest since before humans walked the earth? You don't. You file your report, attend the debriefings, express appropriate regret at the unsuccessful outcome, and try to move on. Except I haven't moved on. I can't, because ever since that moment when the Jason thing touched me, I've been different. The changes are subtle but unmistakable. I'm drawn to water now, not just for drinking or bathing, but with an almost obsessive fascination. I can sit for hours watching rain streak down window panes, or staring into the ripples of pond. Sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see faces in those ripples, fluid, shifting faces with 2 wide smiles and eyes like black glass. And the dreams, God, the dreams, of vast underwater networks spreading beneath entire regions, of an ancient consciousness distributed across countless semi-autonomous entities, of the slow, patient hunger that drives it all. I wake from these dreams soaking wet, my sheets and pillow drenched as if I'd been swimming rather than sleeping. But worst of all is the certainty, the absolute knowledge, that it isn't finished with me, that the toll has merely been deferred, not canceled, that one day, whether through accident or design, I'll find myself back in those woods, following a trail of markers to an entrance that wasn't there before, descending into darkness driven by a compulsion I can't resist. They've taken a piece of me already, you see. Just a small piece, a seed, a connection. And through that connection, they call to me, especially when it rains, that gentle tapping on the roof, on the windows, like fingers drumming a patient rhythm. 3 quick, 2 slow. Pause. Repeat. An invitation. A reminder. A promise. If you ever find yourself hiking in Lolo National Forest, and you come across a trail of bright orange markers leading away from the established paths, I beg you, turn around. No matter how curious you might be, no matter how compelling the mystery, turn around and walk away. Because some tolls are too high to pay, even if you don't realize you're paying them until it's too late. And some searches, once begun, can never truly end. I should know. I'm still searching, even now, still following those markers of my dreams, night after night, drawn ever deeper into the dark, wet heart of Olo, where they're waiting for me to finally, fully pay my toll. I've spent my life capturing moments that others miss. The subtle play of light through autumn leaves. The fleeting expression on a stranger's face. The perfect stillness just before a storm breaks. As a photographer specializing in nature and wildlife, I've trained my eye to notice what remains hidden the most, to see patterns where others perceive only chaos. That's what brought me to Lolo National Forest last autumn. The place had developed something of a reputation among certain photography circles, not for its breathtaking vistas or rare wildlife, but for something far more intriguing: anomalies, peculiar light phenomena that couldn't be explained by conventional optics, strange distortions that appeared only in photographs, never to the naked eye. Some called them digital artifacts or equipment malfunctions. Others, with hushed voices and sidelong glances, suggested something else entirely. I didn't believe the whispers, of course. 20 years in professional photography had taught me that most supernatural phenomena had perfectly rational explanations. Lens flare, moisture on the sensor, double exposure. I debunked dozens of ghost photographs over the years, much to the disappointment of paranormal enthusiasts. So I went to Olo with a skeptic's mindset, determined to identify whatever natural phenomena were creating these photographic anomalies. I brought high-end equipment, a full-frame digital camera, several prime lenses, filters, a light meter, and an infrared camera modification that allowed me to capture wavelengths beyond normal human vision. Scientific tools for a scientific investigation. I booked a small cabin on the eastern edge of the forest for a week-long stay. It was modest but functional. A bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom with temperamental plumbing, and a porch facing the woods. Perfect for my needs. No distractions, no other people, just me and whatever secrets Olo might be willing to reveal. The first 2 days were uneventful. I hiked along established trails, photographing the forest in its autumn splendor. The weather was cooperative. Clear skies, gentle breezes, ideal lighting conditions. My images were technically perfect, but revealed nothing unusual. No anomalies, no distortions, no evidence of anything beyond ordinary woodland beauty. On the third day, the weather shifted. The morning dawned gray and heavy with moisture, the kind of day that promised rain by afternoon. Perfect conditions for a different kind of photography. The forest takes on a different character in rain. Colors deepening, textures transforming as water highlights every crevice and curve. I set out earlier than usual. Wanted to capture transition from dry to wet. My route took me along a less traveled path that wound deeper into the forest, toward an area marked on my map as Raven's Hollow, a small valley supposedly known for its unusual fog patterns and light conditions. As I walked, I could feel the approaching rain in the air, that distinctive scent of ozone and wet earth, the subtle drop in temperature, the peculiar stillness that often precedes a storm. The forest grew denser, the trees older and more gnarled, their branches creating a canopy so thick that the trail existed in a perpetual twilight, even at midday. I stopped occasionally to photograph interesting formations, a tree whose trunk had grown in a perfect spiral, fungi whose colors seemed too vibrant to be natural, patterns of lichen that resembled elaborate writing. Nothing overtly strange, but there was something about this deeper section of forest that felt different, a silence too complete, perhaps an absence of the small sounds that usually fill woodland spaces. No rustling undergrowth, no distant bird calls, no scurrying of small creatures. By the time I reached Raven's Hollow, the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Fat, heavy droplets that pattered on leaves overhead before finding their way to the forest floor. I set up my equipment beneath a small tarp I brought for this purpose, creating a makeshift shelter that would allow me to keep my camera dry while still photographing the rain-soaked landscape. The valley deserved its reputation for unusual light, even with the overcast sky. There was a quality to the illumination here that defied easy description, a diffused glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, creating shadows that didn't quite align with any identifiable light source. Perfect conditions for anomalies, I thought, adjusting my camera settings to account for the low light. I began a methodical documentation of the valley, moving from wide landscape shots to intimate details of rain-slicked bark and water-jeweled spiderwebs. It was during this process as I reviewed images on my camera's LCD screen that I noticed the first irregularity. In a shot of rain falling through a gap in the canopy, there appeared to be a subtle distortion, a kind of ripple in the fabric of the image itself, as if that particular section of space wasn't quite adhering to the same physical laws as its surroundings. I looked up at the actual scene, saw nothing unusual, then back at the image. The distortion remained. Not a lens issue or water on the filter. I checked both meticulously. I took another photograph of the same spot. The anomaly was still there, but in a slightly different position, as if it had moved in the seconds between exposures. Professional curiosity piqued. I switched to rapid continuous shooting, capturing a series of images in quick succession. When I reviewed them as a sequence, my breath caught. The distortion was definitely moving, not randomly, but with purpose, following a precise path through the rain-filled air. I adjusted position, trying different angles, different focal lengths. The anomaly remained present in every image, but only visible through the camera. To my naked eye, there was nothing but rain and trees and gathering mist. As the afternoon progressed and the rain intensified, I began to notice more of these distortions appearing in my photographs. They varied in size and shape. Some were small, barely noticeable ripples, while others occupied significant portions of the frame, bending light around themselves like invisible gravitational lenses. Most unsettling was their apparent awareness. The longer I photographed, the more it seemed they were responding to my presence, to my act of observation. In sequences of images, they would appear to approach the camera, retreat when I moved suddenly, return when I remained still, like curious animals investigating an intruder in their territory. By late afternoon, the rain had become a proper downpour, and a fog was rising from the valley floor, further complicating the already strange quality of light. I should have headed back. The sensible thing would have been to return to the cabin, analyze the images I had already collected, return another day with perhaps more specialized equipment. But I couldn't leave. Not when I was finally documenting something genuinely unexplainable. Not when each new image revealed more complex behaviors in these invisible presences. So I stayed as darkness began to fall, setting up my small field lights to continue photographing. With the artificial illumination, the anomalies became even more pronounced, more numerous. They seemed to gather around the lights, creating complex patterns of distortion that occasionally resolved into almost recognizable shapes before dissolving again into chaotic ripples. It was nearing full dark when I captured the image that changed everything. A simple shot of rain falling through the beam of my strongest light. When I checked the preview on my screen, I froze. There, perfectly illuminated in the center of the frame, was what appeared to be a face. Not human, at least not entirely. The proportions were wrong, the features too fluid, as a composed of the rain itself. But unmistakably a face, with eyes that seemed to be looking directly into the lens. Directly at me, I raised my gaze from the screen to the actual scene before me. Nothing, just rain and light and gathering darkness. I took another photograph of the same spot. The face was gone, but in its place was a more complex distortion, one that stretched across the entire frame like a tear in reality itself. That should have been my cue to leave. Every instinct was screaming at me to pack up, to retreat to the safety of the cabin, to rationality and electric lights and solid walls. But the photographer in me, the documenter, the witness, couldn't walk away from whatever was revealing itself through my camera. So I continued, even as the rain grew heavier and the darkness more complete, until my world had narrowed to the small illuminated space created by my lights and the images appearing on my camera screen. The anomalies were evolving with each new photograph. They became more defined, more intentional in their formations. What had begun as simple distortions were now complex patterns, symmetrical arrangements, Structures that suggested intelligence and purpose. And faces. More faces. Some almost human. Others entirely alien. All composed of that same fluid, rain-like substance. They never appeared to my naked eye, only through the camera. As if the lens was translating something my human perception couldn't process into terms my brain could comprehend. I don't know exactly when I realized I was no longer alone in any conventional sense. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden revelation, just a gradual awareness that the space around me had become occupied, that I was being observed with the same intensity with which I was observing. The rain provided a perfect medium for them. Whatever they were, water droplets refracting light, creating momentary prisms, catching and bending the artificial glow of my equipment. Perfect camouflage for entities that seemed to exist in the boundary between visible and invisible, tangible and intangible. I should have been terrified. Perhaps on some level I was. But the photographer's instinct overrode fear. The compulsion to document, to record, to witness. I kept shooting, adjusting settings, trying different techniques to better capture what my eyes couldn't see, but my camera somehow could. It was during this focus state that I felt the first touch. A sensation like cold, damp fingers brushing the back of my neck. I spun around, saw nothing but rain and darkness. When I returned to my camera, the screen showed something new. A clear image of what appeared to be a hand, composed of water droplets held in impossible formation, extended toward a precise spot on my neck where I'd felt that touch. The barrier was thinning. Whatever separated their reality from mine was becoming permeable, and I had the sudden, horrifying realization that perhaps my camera wasn't just recording these entities. It was somehow facilitating their crossing. Each photograph was a door, each image a threshold, and I had been systematically removing the locks. I lowered the camera, suddenly reluctant to continue, but as I glanced at the screen one last time, I saw a message had formed in the raindrops captured there. Don't stop now. The words hung in the frame, perfectly legible despite being composed of suspended water droplets frozen in the moment of exposure. And beneath them, smaller, we have so much to show you. My hands trembled as I raised the viewfinder to my eye again. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible, that I was experiencing some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But the images didn't lie. My equipment was functioning perfectly, capturing something real, something that existed, perhaps in a spectrum of reality just adjacent to our own. I took another photograph. The screen showed the valley transformed. Where there had been only trees and rain and gathering mist, there were now structures, impossible architectures composed of light and water and shadow, stretching throughout the space. And moving among these structures were figures, hundreds of them, all with that same fluid quality, as if they were formed from the rain itself. I looked up from the camera, still nothing visible to the naked eye, but now that I knew what to look for, I could almost sense them. Disturbances in the air, subtle shifts in the patterns of falling rain, a quality of attention focused in my direction. I took another shot, and another, each revealing more details of this hidden world. The images on my screen showed the figures drawing closer, their features becoming more distinct. Some appeared almost human. Others were utterly alien in form. All seemed to be reaching toward the camera, toward me, and there were faces I recognized now. A hiker who had gone missing in these woods last year, his disappearance a brief local news story, a famous nature photographer who had vanished in Olo a decade ago, her case still unsolved. Others I didn't know but whose expressions conveyed a terrible understanding. They had been photographers too, observers, witnesses, until they became part of what they were witnessing. I lowered the camera, took a step back. My heel caught on a tree root, and I stumbled slightly. That small movement saved me, because in the moment I was off balance, Something moved through the space where I've been standing. Something substantial enough to displace the rain, creating a momentary dry corridor in the downpour. It was trying to touch me, to make contact. And somehow I knew that if it succeeded, I would join those other faces I'd seen. I would become part of this realm that existed alongside ours, visible only through the translator of a camera lens. I packed my equipment with shaking hands, no longer concerned with keeping it dry, focused only on speed. All around me, the rain began to move in unnatural patterns, swirling, forming momentary shapes that dissolved before fully resolving, creating brief dry spaces that indicated the presence of solid but invisible forms. They were manifesting more strongly now, drawing on the energy of the storm, using the abundant water as a medium for crossing over. And I had provided the connection, the door, through my persistent observation, my detailed documentation, my willing witness. As I shouldered my backpack and turned to leave, my foot slipped on the rain-slick ground, and I fell hard, the impact driving the breath from my lungs. My camera, despite being packed away, switched on inside my bag. I could see the faint glow of its screen through the fabric. And all around me, the rain stopped, not everywhere, but in a perfect circle extending about 10 feet in every direction. The downpour halted in midair, thousands of droplets suspended, as if time itself had frozen. Only it hadn't, because I could still move, could still breathe the suddenly heavy, too moist air inside this impossible bubble of stillness. Within the suspended rain, shapes began to form, more solid now, more defined than anything I'd seen in my photographs. Figures composed of water droplets held in complex, impossible formations, their features fluid but recognizable, their movements graceful and deliberate as they closed in around me. One stepped forward or flowed forward, its method of locomotion defying conventional description. Its face kept shifting, cycling through features I recognized from my earlier images. The missing hiker, the lost photographer, others, before settling on something entirely non-human, a visage of pure, rippling water that nonetheless conveyed clear intelligence and purpose. It extended what approximated a hand toward me, not threatening, but inviting. The rain droplets near its fluid fingertips formed words in midair. See through our eyes now. I scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the approaching figure. My back hit a tree trunk, leaving me nowhere else to retreat. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding muffled in the strange acoustics of the suspended rain bubble. The rain droplets rearranged themselves. Watchers, recordists, like you. Another figure moved forward, this one bearing the unmistakable features of the famous photographer who had vanished years earlier. Her water-composed face held an expression of what might have been ecstasy or agony, impossible to distinguish. She reached toward my camera bag. "Show US what you've seen. We'll show you everything." Understanding bloomed with horrible clarity. They had been people once, observers, documenters, witnesses like me, but somehow they had crossed a threshold, had been absorbed into this rain realm, this adjacent reality. And now they wanted me to join them, to add my perspective, my unique way of seeing to their collective. "I need to go," I said, struggling to my feet, clutching my bag protectively. "People are expecting me. They know where I am." The raindrops shifted again. No one ever really leaves Olo. The suspended droplets began to vibrate, creating a sound like thousands of tiny bells or distant chimes. The effect was both beautiful and terrifying, a music that seemed to resonate directly with something deep in my brain, bypassing my ears entirely. I felt a powerful compulsion to take out my camera, to continue documenting, to join this communion of watchers. My fingers actually moved toward the zipper of my bag before I caught myself. That's how it happened to the others. I realized they hadn't been taken against their will. They had been seduced by the opportunity to see what no one else could see, to document what had never been documented, to witness the truly unknown, the ultimate photographer's temptation. With tremendous effort, I tore my gaze away from the water entities and their hypnotic movements. I focused instead on the edge of the suspended rain bubble, on the normal downpour still falling beyond it, on the path that would lead back to the cabin, to safety, to the ordinary world. I ran, or tried to. Moving through suspended droplets was like pushing through invisible molasses. The air itself seemed to resist my passage. Behind me, the bell-like tones took on a more urgent quality, and I felt rather than saw the water entities converging on my position. Something cold and wet wrapped around my ankle. Not a hand in any conventional sense, but concentration of water droplets moving with coordinated purpose. I kicked free, but another caught my arm, and another brushed against my face with a touch like ice water. Where each touched, I felt a peculiar numbness, as if that part of me was being harmonized with their rain frequency, tuned to their particular vibration. My vision began to sparkle at the edges, normal perception giving way to something else, a hyper-awareness of light and moisture and subtle gradations I'd never been conscious of before. I was beginning to see as they saw, beginning to transition. With a final, desperate surge of effort, I lunged toward the edge of the suspended rain bubble. The resistance increased dramatically, as if the very air had become solid. Behind me, the chiming reached a fever pitch, and I felt dozens of cold, wet touches all over my body, my back, my arms, my neck, my face. Then, with a sensation like breaking through a membrane, I burst out of the bubble and into the normal rain beyond. I didn't look back, didn't slow down, just ran headlong down the path toward the cabin, slipping and sliding on the mud, branches whipping at my face, my camera bag bouncing painfully against my spine. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, until the peculiar numbness where the water entities had touched me began to fade, until the strange enhanced perception receded and the world looked normal again, just a dark forest in a heavy rainstorm. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked every door, closed every curtain, and huddled in the center of the main room, still wearing my muddy, soaked clothes, my camera bag clutched to my chest like a shield. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Occasionally, I thought I heard that bell-like tone beneath the steady drumming on the roof. Once, I could have sworn I saw raindrops on the window briefly form a face with my features, before dissolving back into random patterns. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the first gray light of dawn appeared, I packed my belongings, got in my car, and left Lolo National Forest behind. I drove straight through to the nearest major city, booked a hotel room with bright lights and solid walls, and the background noise of thousands of normal, oblivious humans going about their lives. It was only there, in that anonymous hotel room, that I finally found the courage to review the images from Raven's Hollow. Most were as I remembered, the progression from simple distortions to complex forms, the faces, the evidence of something that should not exist but undeniably did. But the final images, the ones taken after I fell, when my camera had switched on inside my bag, those were different. They showed Raven's Hollow from impossible angles, aerial views, perspectives from inside trees, vantage points no human photographer could have accessed. And in every one, a blurred figure that I recognized with sickening certainty as myself, running in terror through the rain. My camera had continued taking photographs, but I hadn't been the one taking them. The last image was the most disturbing of all. A perfectly composed shot of me enter my cabin, taken from perspective of the rain itself. Thousands of droplets each containing a tiny reflection, combine and create a composite image of extraordinary detail, and in the corner of the frame, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it, what appeared to be my own face, formed in raindrops, watching my human self with an expression of patient hunger, A piece of me had stayed behind. Or perhaps more accurately, a piece of them had come with me. I erased all the images, formatted the memory cards. Later, I sold my camera equipment and abandoned professional photography entirely. These days, I avoid taking pictures even with my phone. I've developed what my friends consider an irrational aversion to being photographed, and I stay indoors when it rains. But sometimes catching sight of my reflection in a window or mirror, I notice something strange about my eyes, a quality of light, a way of seeing that doesn't feel entirely mine. In those moments, I remember the entities in the rain, their invitation, their hunger to witness and be witnessed. And I wonder if I truly escaped Lolo Forest, or if I simply brought a piece of it back with me. A seed, a spore, a droplet of something that is slowly, patiently, transforming me from within. The next time you're walking in the rain and you feel that prickling sensation of being watched, remember, not all observers are visible, and not all photographs capture only what their takers intend. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. And Olo is always watching, always waiting, for another witness to join its eternal observation, for another photographer to step willingly into the frame.